Well, good morning, everybody. I'm told you can now hear me. I apologise if we're running 2 minutes late. I'm talking to you from Sidcup, and I woke up in Manchester. So it's been a long day already. But it's a great pleasure to be back speaking at your conference. I think we've got 45 minutes or so, and I'll try and fill about 25 or so of those, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions. And for those of you who don't know, HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, is a think tank. We're based in Oxford. We're the country's only specialist think tank just for higher education, and we're a charity, and we get support from universities up and down the UK. I'm talking to you actually from a specialist drama college called Rose Bruford College, and that's typical of the sort of organisation we get support from. And my own background is not as a university member of staff. I've been a student at 3 different universities. I'm a governor at 2 universities. I was in 12 hours of governor meetings in Manchester yesterday. But I'm also a former special advisor, so I've worked directly for government ministers setting policy. And I've been asked to talk this morning about higher education in turbulent political times, which I will do in a moment. But hopefully my background in Whitehall gives me some experience with which to do that. We've currently got a vacancy, so if you know anyone who wants to work in higher education policy, do send them our way. What we're most well known for is probably our publications, and we do a range of publications, and a flavour of them is on the screen there, from the green one, which not surprisingly is about climate change, the red one's about how the education sector is seen in the media. The one in the middle on the top row is about graduate gender pay gap. One in the bottom middle, student accommodation. So it gives you a sense of the range of things we cover. We're a tiny organisation. We only have 4 members of staff, but we try to keep a roving eye on everything really to do with higher education. And we do a daily blog, which you might want to sign up to if you want to keep up to speed day to day. It's free with the things going on in our higher education sector. An example of some of the recent things we've blogged about are there. A piece, for example, from me on who the new free speech champion might be. The government is committed to having a new champion for free speech in higher education. And we don't yet know who it's going to be, but it's a very, very controversial and important role. So that gives you an example of the sort of things we cover on our blog. So I've been asked to talk about higher education in turbulent political times. So the first thing I want to start with is really noting the volume of change that we've already been living through. I have done this. It's updated, but I have done a slide similar to this. Most of my slides are new, but I have done a slide similar to this at your conference in the past. But I add to it all the time because there has been a huge amount of change in our sector in the last 5 or 6 years. HEPI, the main regulator of universities, closed down and replaced with the Office for Students. We've had 3 general elections in that period. We've had the referendum. We've had major bits of new higher education legislation. We've had the Auger report. So we've had, I'm not going to go through each bullet, don't worry. We've had a huge amount of change going on in our sector already. And you would think that at this point in the cycle, where we've had one political party in charge of Westminster since 2010, that everything would be clear. You might think the government would have a clear strategy and know what it wants to do, particularly given all the reforms it's already done. In fact, that's not the position we're in at all. It was quite clear, I think, what David Cameron thought of higher education, or at least what his government, his coalition government, his majority Conservative government wanted to do with higher education. They tripled fees, for example, put students at the heart of the system was what they said they wanted to do. Theresa May comes along, a slightly different approach, a bit more controlling over universities, but again, she was very clear what she wanted to do. She was the person who set up the Auger report, for example. She was the person who presided over the final stages of the Higher Education and Research Act, which set up the Office for Students as a new tough market regulator of our universities. We don't really know what the Johnson government wants to do. Boris Johnson himself has been a little all over the shop. on higher education. I think his old advisor, Dominic Cummings, who's now fallen out with him, calls him the trolley, like a shopping trolley veering from issue to issue. And there's certainly been a bit of that on the way that Boris Johnson looks at higher education. When he was the shadow higher education minister in the 2000s, for example, he wrote, it's rather small on my screen, so I hope you can see it, bottom left, Mickey Mouse degrees are just the job, big piece in his highly paid Telegraph column. Then much more recently, of course, his government had been suggesting, not really putting the flesh on the bones, but suggesting they want to root out low-value courses, which are the very courses that some people call Mickey Mouse. So it's a little bit unclear. And it's 2.5 years since Philip Auger reported to government, commissioned by government, with a really lengthy report on all the reforms to higher education that he proposed should happen. It was a report to government, and 2.5 years on, we still don't have a formal government response to it. So it's a rather odd time to be giving you a speech, because we might get flesh on the bones this side of Christmas. The government is dropping very big hints that they would like to publish a consultation document on their approach to higher education. Actually, 2 consultation documents on their approach to higher education this side of Christmas. They've had all sorts of deadlines come and go in the past, so we'll see if they keep to this one, but it might be rather helpful in terms of getting them back on track after all the sleaze allegations. And actually, just in the last 24 hours, they've started to hint at things. So, for example, the previous Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, his big idea, the one big policy, for example, that he talked a lot about in his final speech as Secretary of State for Education. I was in the room, well, he delivered it online, but I was in the room to the audience he was delivering it to at the university's UK annual conference back in September. He said, I'm going to accelerate a brand new university admissions system so that people apply to university after they've got their exam results, which does happen in other parts of the world. It's common in Scotland too, here in the UK, but is not so common in England. You get, you apply to university before you get your results. That was Gavin Williamson's really big reform that he wanted to drive through. We and others poured some cold water on that. We said that actually exams are not as perfect an indicator of a potential as post-qualification systems assume, and that actually the crisis, the pandemic, has shown with teacher-assessed grades and centre-assessed grades that actually teachers probably know best what the potential is of their borderline students. Anyway, Gavin Williamson is now gone, and we now have a new Secretary of State for Education. And one of the reasons that there was almost nothing about higher education in the spending review that happened a fortnight or so ago, when we'd expected it, one of the reasons nothing happened was Nadeem Zahawi was such a new Education Secretary of State, coming from his old job in helping sort out vaccines, that he didn't want to announce big new policies until he'd got his feet under the table. And that's why there were very little, but in the way of, I was asked to speak about the spending review, but there was very little in the way of education announcements in the spending review outside of research. But as I say, we are just creeping towards a clearer government position on all of this. And yesterday, in a big speech she gave in London, Michelle Donnellan, the universities minister, started saying they were going to get much tougher on universities in terms of access and participation. So what this means is they've got a new director for fair access and participation, who is going to put huge pressure on universities to work with schools, to do more with school children, to raise their achievement levels. And they're going to force every university that has an access and participation agreement with the Office for Students to rewrite it. And what the government is saying is, yes, it's all about access. We want you to do lots more with schools, but it's also about participation, reducing your dropout rates, and it's about what people do after they finish studying, graduation. So they're saying they're going to be much tougher on universities with high dropout rates, with low graduate employability rates, and so on and so forth. So we got that only yesterday. People are still digesting it. And another thing in my final slide of my first section of my speech about the political turmoil is that actually almost every big job in certainly English higher education is up for grabs at the moment. So, well, Nadeem Zahawi's just got into his seat at Secretary of State for Education. The lady bottom right there is Nicola Dandridge, who's Chief Executive of the Office for Students. Well, she's announced she's off in April. So that's probably the single most important job in English HE coming up for grabs. The chap above her, James Wharton, is the chair of the Office for Students. Well, he's brand new, a former Conservative MP. He hasn't done much in public yet. So again, that's a bit of an unknown. Man next to him going around like anti-clockwise is David Sweeney, who's head of Research England, which distributes a lot of the research funding to universities. Well, he's just announced he's off. And then the chap at the sort of top there is John Blake, who I referred to a moment ago, who's the new chap who's going to be holding universities responsible for that access and participation. So all those people are either new in post or about to leave in post, which again, I think helps explain the title I've been given of higher education policy in turbulent political times. But let me come on to some things that I think are clearly happening nonetheless. And the first is to do with the size and shape of our sector. There are two drivers of this. Most people only focus on one. Most people only focus on the birth rate. How many 18-year-olds were born, are there now because they were born 18 years ago? Most people think most people I talk to anyway, think that's the key driver of future demand for higher education. And you can see it there in the yellow. That is the number of 18-year-olds. And what it shows, very briefly, is there are more 18-year-olds every one of the next 10 years. So if you've got young kids like I do, you'll know the schools have been crammed, and that wave is now just beginning to hit universities. But by the way, it's nothing like the biggest driver of higher education demand. The biggest driver of higher education demand is the proportion of however many 18-year-olds there are who make it, and I'm talking here about young full-time students who make it to higher education. And that's been growing for decades. There's a zigzag only when the higher fees came in and people cancelled their gap years. But of course, if we had more up-to-date data, and there's always a horrible time lag in higher education data, we'd see, more increases towards the end of those lines. Because, for example, the big A-level inflation grade increases that we've seen in the last year or two have opened the door to higher education for more people. So we need to get ready for further expansion. We've calculated it at, just for England, just full time, and the demographics in places like Scotland are a bit different, so they do need to be calculated separately. But we've calculated that just in England, just full-time student places, we need 350,000 extra by 2035, which is, currently the Russell Group all the Russell Group universities put together educate 320,000 students. So having another 350,000 is like another whole equivalent to the Russell Group. And who knows where those students will go? They might go to existing institutions, as has been happening in recent years, or the Levelling Up Department under Michael Gove is increasingly interested in encouraging new institutions in places where they don't currently have a university, but where there might be a case for having one. Thanet, Doncaster, Blackpool, places like that. Because this demand is coming higher education's way, and because the government's finances are crook, the government is looking very seriously at how it can further save costs on higher education. They should have announced it in the spending review. That would have been the normal process, but it didn't happen. And they're looking at various ways of doing that. One is minimum entry qualifications. So they say, well, you just can't go to university unless you've got good, at least GCSE results in English and maths. And another thing they want to do is regulate out the bad courses by making the Office for Students toughen up, essentially. And a third way, and this is, I think, almost guaranteed to happen and will probably be announced in a matter of days, trying to get more money out of people who've graduated. So when and we've done a lot of modelling on this, which is all explained on our website, and which I don't have time, sadly, to go into in detail, but I'll just give you a very top level flavour of it. The current system, 54p in every pound lent to students is predicted not to be repaid. This is because, for example, if you haven't paid off your student loan within 30 years, the taxpayer does it for you. And the cost to the taxpayers of that is about £9.4 billion a year, because, as I say, 54p in the pound is not being repaid. And the part of the reason for that is the student loan repayment threshold is very high. You don't pay anything back until you're on nearly £28,000 a year, whereas other countries with loan systems have, for example, lower repayment rates. And when the current system was introduced, it was meant to be a write-off of about 33p in the pound, something like that. So much more like a loan and less like a grant. And our modelling and others' modelling have shown that if you were therefore to reduce the student loan repayment threshold, there'd be a windfall to government. We haven't suggested that should happen. We've merely said that if the government is desperate to save money from higher education, this would be a better route than reducing the number of student places or underfunding universities so that they go bust. But it would be controversial because graduates would be expected to repay more out of their pay packets each month. If, for example, you put people who are currently graduating from university on the same repayment regime as people who previously went to university under Tony Blair's £3,000 fees, you put them on the same repayment schedule, then you could save nearly £4 billion a year. And we recommended, if anything like that were to happen, that some of that money should be reinvested in the system in maintenance grants for the poorest students, which still exist in the UK outside England, but they don't exist in England. Of course, many people would vehemently disagree with that is a good idea. And we've published a brand new report out today. You may have read about it in this morning's Guardian or today's evening's Standard or online, or heard about it on the radio this morning. We published a report based on focus groups among people with large student debts, talking about how that debt makes them feel. And for many of them, it does feel like a real psychological burden on them. And therefore, of course, if the government were to toughen up the repayment terms, there might be some people actually who psychologically find that better because the chance of paying off their entire loan seems more feasible if they're paying back more each month. But there will be other people who you know, according to the report it's not by me, it's by two academics that we put out today, could psychologically be affected by that because it would make the debt feel even more real. And that's something I guess we have to bear in mind too. So on the third and final part of my speech, because it would be great if we could fit in time for a bit of Q&A or getting involved in the chat. I just wanted to talk a bit about how the pandemic's affected the university world. I mean, I've been speaking to this conference for a few years, and I look back at what I'd said in the past, and of course, COVID was not something on anybody's risk radar, and it's been traumatic for the sector, as you will well know if you're either a student or you know a student or you've got students in your family or whatever. And perhaps the most well-known piece of research the HEPI does each year is a survey that we do with Advance HE. And we've been doing it for many, many years. So we can track longitudinally things like, what do students think about the value for money they're getting from their university? And for the first time ever in 2021, when the pandemic was raging, more students, a lot more students than said they were getting bad value for money than say they were getting good value for money. So it's a really significant turnaround, and it goes it's a huge survey, so I'm only going to show you 2 data points, but it goes for other data points in the survey too. So for example, this chart shows, again, for the first time ever, more students thought their experience at university was worse than expected, and a lot more thought that than thought it had been better than expected. Normally those figures are the other way around. So there's a significant proportion of students who think they had a really bad deal last year, and who am I to say they were wrong, despite despite staff working their socks off to make sure it was as good as possible in the circumstances. Now, there are some people who've responded to COVID who say, look, it will change everything. It will change everything. Education will never be the same ever again. And an example of that is this piece from the New Statesman. I mean, if you can find all sorts of examples, but I'll just give you one piece from the New Statesman where someone said, now that a lot of teaching and learning has moved online in the crisis, that will be a permanent shift. And they even argued that people all over the world can learn and teach to huge groups of students at close to zero marginal cost, which will revolutionize the delivery of higher education and research. Well, anybody who delivers good online teaching knows it's nothing like zero marginal cost, but nonetheless, that is the argument that's out there. And we tested this with some polling, which was quite interesting. I mean, we actually first asked this question before we had ever heard of COVID, but we just said to students, because we thought it'd be an interesting thing to know, we said to students, if face-to-face lectures had to stop for whatever reason, we didn't know COVID was going to happen, if face-to-face lectures had to stop for whatever reason, what would you want to take their place? And the most popular answer by a long way, more than half here, the blue here, was other forms of face-to-face teaching. Sorry, it's the first orange. Sorry, the first tall orange bar. And the one of the less popular answers was EdTech, technological stuff. And after the crisis, the question was re-asked, and the face-to-face teaching had become even more popular, which is a tall blue column on the left, and then EdTech stuff had become less popular, even less popular, if you like. The ratio of the popularity of face-to-face to EdTech had gone from 3 to 1 to 2 to 1. So I'm a big fan of EdTech, and I think it brings a really good quality teaching and learning to all sorts of groups that have never had it before. Mature students, or really haven't had really good access before anyway. Mature students, people in developing countries, people who can't travel for other reasons. But intriguingly, certainly when it comes to young people, actually the pandemic did the opposite of what things like that New Statesman article predicted. It actually reinforced the traditional model of higher education, as I think this slide shows. So on the left, you've got UCAS saying that more students than ever before are going through the UCAS system on their way to university. And we've got students at York, which has turned out to be a particularly popular university this year, having to be housed in Hull, 36 miles away, where there is some spare accommodation, because Hull's not been having quite, I mean, Hull's a great university, but it's not been having quite such a successful set of recruitment years as somewhere like York. So intriguingly, unlike a lot of the predictions, higher education, the traditional 3 years away from home, residential, face-to-face higher education experience, at least for young full-time school leavers, has actually come into its own in the crisis. And I as I said before, I woke up in Manchester this morning, where I was, and Oxford Road in Manchester yesterday. I was walking up and down, where you've got Manchester University, Manchester Metropolitan University, the Royal Northern College of Music. It's come back to life. It's a really, really fantastic to see all the students there again, living not a completely normal student life, but much better than last year. And then just before I stop, I just wanted to raise a couple of other issues, because it would be wrong for me not to raise them. Universities, a very, very significant proportion of university income comes from research. It doesn't come from students. Obviously, that's more true of the research intensive Russell Group end of the sector than it is, say, for the sort of institution that I'm talking to you from today. But nonetheless, all the political parties have been making very bold commitments on research spending in recent years, making, for example, a promise to spend 2.4% of our national wealth, our GDP, gross domestic product, on research and development within the next few years. This matters. It matters to the country. It was a university that invented the vaccine, the Oxford vaccine. It matters for economic development. It matters for the world. But I'm also, and it matters for universities, because relative to other countries, we do a higher proportion of our research inside universities than other countries. But I'm deeply skeptical that it will happen. Most countries set targets like this, and they nearly always miss them. To give you one example of that, Tony Blair set a target soon after the millennium of spending 2.5% of GDP on research and development by 2014. Well, you can see on this chart we were about 1.6 at the end of his target period. Nowhere near. We didn't make any progress at all during his period. And so the idea we're suddenly going to get on the trajectory of the dotted red line there, I find challenging to believe. It'd be fantastic if it happened. I hope it does, but I find challenging to believe. And of course, the one announcement about the spending review that was the one announcement about higher education that was in the spending review was actually a £2 billion reduction in public spending on research and development by 2024-25 relative to the previous plans. So if anything, we're currently going downwards rather than upwards, at least on the trajectory that had previously been laid out. So just to conclude, firstly, I think sadly for people working in universities, there may be it looks a bit different when you're sitting in a think tank thinking about these things. But the next few years, despite me saying I think we're at the calm before the storm stage, we can be certain the next few years are going to be very fruity in higher education policy. There's a skills bill currently before the Houses of Parliament. There's a freedom of speech bill currently before the Houses of Parliament. We know school exams won't be back to normal next year. There's lots of reviews going on of things like the National Students Survey and the Teaching Excellence Framework. Brexit remains an unknown. We still don't know if UK will be in Horizon Europe, the big research project. We're not in Erasmus, but we could still be in Horizon Europe, but no one knows. We've got strikes in the sector, 1st, 2nd, 3rd of December over pensions and pay. There's a continuing fluctuation in those pre-university qualifications. The government's just performed I'm short of time, so I'm using shorthand, but the government's very down on BTECs, which are a very popular route into higher education, and want T-levels, technical level exams, to replace them. But they've recently had to do a U-turn on that, because getting rid of BTECs would be so bad for social mobility and widening participation. And of course, the culture wars that keep on raging through our country often have universities at there as a target. Again, we've published a lot on that recently with the UPP Foundation. If you'd like to know more about what the great British public actually think about universities, and it's not always as negative as the politicians might have you believe. Two more slides and then I will stop. Very interesting but salutary and worrying piece of desk research someone did for us was to overlay 1970s inflation on top of the £9,250 tuition fee. Now, you might say that's a very unrealistic thing to do. I hope it is, but inflation is rising and it is eating into the 9,250 tuition fee. And what this chart shows is if we did have 1970s inflation rates, hence the garish 1970s wallpaper, then the 9,250 fee wouldn't be worth much more than a couple of grand within a few years. So that really would push universities to the wall, make the university experience very poor, stop us being internationally competitive and all the rest of it. I'm not predicting it's going to happen. I'm just saying that every time inflation it inches up a notch, that's bad for students in terms of their living costs, and it's bad for institutions in terms of their resources for teaching. And then just a little flavour of what we've got coming up, and hope it might be of interest. As I say, strikes are starting in our sector on the 1st of December. We've got a report on the strikes coming out on the day before the strikes begin, looking at who owns the recorded lectures that students will be watching during the strikes. We've got a report on how links to the culture war I referred to at the end, how we might get the government think more positively about universities in early December. And then we've got a report early next year on first and family students. So I'll stop there. I see there's some questions in the Q&A. I think unless anyone speaks up and interrupts me, I think it's my job to sort of go through those and chair the Q&A session myself. So let me try and do that. There's one from Ian, who says, if the Auger review is enacted and fees are capped at 7,500, which is what Auger recommended, or 8,500, could we expect a return of the teaching grant to make up for the shortfall? So in other words, if universities get less in fees because fees are reduced, would the government make up the difference? Well, Ian clearly knows what he's talking about there, so he will know that Philip Auger said the shortfall should be made up, just as Ed Miliband, when he recommended reducing tuition fees at the 2015 election, said the Treasury would make up the gap. But I've worked in Whitehall and I've negotiated with the Treasury, and I do not believe the Treasury would be up for that. So my answer to your question would be no. We should not expect the teaching grant to make up the shortfall, certainly not in its entirety. In fact, the reason we have high fees in the first place is because the Treasury wasn't willing to fund our universities properly using taxpayers' money. Ian has another question, so let's go to that one. We still perhaps haven't seen the impact of COVID on student mental health and social anxiety. Anything from HEPI coming forward to monitor this and hopefully influence government support and funding? Yeah, I mean, there is a crisis among our young people in terms of their mental health. I'm a parent of two young children myself, and our annual poll of students has been showing for years. We were the first organisation actually to lift the Office for National Statistics questions about well-being and ask them only of students. And students, we've shown year after year, have less good well-being than the population as a whole, and that is a major social problem. And we did do some little pulse surveys, small surveys during the crisis that showed the crisis was impacting student and also, by the way, staff mental health that we've done work on as well. And we will do more work on that, particularly probably around loneliness. And it is a big issue, and we really need to think about such a big break point in young people's lives going away to university. And the one guarantee, of course, is if we underfund universities, there'll be less mental health support, less good sports facilities, all those other things that are good for your mental well-being as well. So I share Ian's concern, but I better move on to the next question. I'll come back to Ian's third question. Let me go to someone else. Muriel Bankhead says, the UK is unique in encouraging students to choose university anywhere in the country. What impact does that have on provision of HE? We are unusual. I mean, of course, if you go to an Ivy League university in America, you might move halfway across America. But we are very, very unusual in expecting such a high proportion of people to move away from home. I think it's a reflection of the hierarchy in our sector. You know, in England, again, Scotland is different, but in England, of course, was 600 years or so, there were only two universities, Oxford and Cambridge. So you had to move if you were going to study. And because they're so much older than every other one, they will always be more prestigious than every other one. So there's this hierarchy that sort of forces people to move away. I think there are some advantages of moving away. It's a good transition to adulthood, but it massively increases the costs of the system, massively. And we published a really interesting, I think it's a really interesting report by an architectural historian on the history of student accommodation that looks into all the whys and wherefores of this. He's called William White. It's on our website, and I would urge people to look at it. As I say, I think there are pros and cons of our model, but it is very expensive relative to other countries. Di Drinkwater says, the upcoming reports, would you be able to have access to these? Yes, absolutely. As a charity, all our reports are freely available on our website, hepi.ac.uk. Sort of one of the things the Charity Commission expect of us is to put our research in the public domain. It's all there. And we obviously value people engaging with it. What do I think the effect of Brexit has been on the sector so far? David Williams asks. Yeah, I mean, HEPI, as I've already said, is a charity. HEPI itself didn't take a position pro or anti-Brexit. And I think in some ways Brexit, but universally the sector was against it. I only know one vice chancellor who wasn't. And I think in some ways it hasn't been as bad as they feared. But that's partly because the big decisions haven't yet been made. We still don't know if we're going to be in Horizon Europe or not. On student numbers, it's been exactly, we literally predicted, some work London Economics did for us, we predicted a 57% drop in incoming EU students. The last UCAS data I saw had a 56% drop. So we were bang on, 1% out. More than a halving in the number of incoming students. And that's bad. That means less diverse campuses. Some courses cease to be viable, and it's a shame. I mean, demand from non-EU countries has continued to be very, very strong, but not from that. Ian asked questions about university pensions. Can we expect the government to look at teachers' pensions? The pensions issue is huge. I've written a history of the USS pension. So do have a look on our website for that. The government wants nothing to do with the USS pension. It's a private sector scheme run by universities. It has the biggest deficit of any pension scheme in the country on some measures. And that's why the strikes are happening, because that deficit needs to be filled in. The unions don't accept the deficit is as big as the employers say. I think I've just got a funny message on my screen, which I think tells me this is coming to an end, which is a great shame. There's only one question I didn't get to, which was Ian's question on unconditional offers, and how they can be, how some may be working around the system, and it seems to be an unfair playing field. And I think unconditional offers are a controversial subject, and are being weeded out of the system actually to some degree by things the government are doing. So I just had a message pop up on my screen, so I'm going to look to Roxana or Nicholas or someone to tell me if or maybe they'll just close us. I'm out of time, so I'm going to have to stop the session. But my email address is n.hillman@hepi.ac.uk. If there's any questions we didn't get to, or you want to engage some more, please do drop me an email. It's been a great pleasure talking to you again. Thank you.